My stepmother kicked me out on my 18th birthday. She said I inherited a worthless cider mill. What I found inside saved me. And if you've ever been told you're worthless, or that the things you love don't matter, then this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button because we're going to talk about what it means to find value where no one else can see it. The front door clicked shut behind me with a sound of absolute finality. It wasn't a slam, nothing so dramatic. Just a quiet, mechanical little noise that severed the last thread connecting me to the life I'd known. I stood on the pristine concrete porch of the house that had never felt like mine and stared at the perfectly manicured lawn. My duffel bag, heavy with the few clothes and books that were truly mine, dug into my shoulder. In my hand, I held a thin manila envelope. "You're an adult now, Leo," Cheryl had said, her voice as sterile as the white kitchen behind her. She didn't look at me, focusing instead on wiping down a countertop that was already gleaming. "Your father's estate is settled. This is the last of it. Your grandfather's property." She'd slid the envelope across the granite island. It had felt cold to the touch. "It's nothing," she'd added, a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Some old wreck of a cider mill up in the middle of nowhere, probably condemned. The property taxes are past due, of course, but it's yours now. The burden is officially transferred." A burden. That's what I was. That's what this last piece of my family was. I hadn't said anything. There were no words left between us. 2 years. 2 years of living in my father's house with his new wife after he was gone. 2 years of being a ghost at their dinner table, a silent occupant of a room that felt more like a storage unit for a dead man's son. My 18th birthday wasn't a celebration. It was an eviction date. I walked down the driveway, the crunch of my worn sneakers on the gravel, the only sound. I didn't look back. There was nothing to see. I reached the sidewalk and finally stopped, the suburban quiet suddenly feeling vast and threatening. I was 18, an adult, and utterly, completely alone. I sank down onto the curb, the rough concrete biting into my legs through my thin jeans. I pulled the envelope from my jacket pocket and opened the metal clasp. Inside was a single, heavy, old-fashioned iron key, its teeth worn and complicated. There was a folded, yellowing deed, the paper brittle at the creases. And tucked inside the deed was a thin stack of $20 bills. 5 of them. $100. A final, pathetic severance package. I stared at the key. It felt ancient, like something from a storybook. It was cold and solid and real. More real than anything in that sterile house I'd just left. The address on the deed was for a place called Black Creek, a town I'd never heard of, in a county I couldn't place on a map. My grandfather's place. Abe. My mom's dad. He had passed away almost 2 years ago, just a few months after my own father. It had been a brutal 1-2 punch that had knocked the world out from under me. I hadn't been able to go to his funeral. Cheryl had said it was too far, too much of a hassle. The truth was, she wanted to cut every tie to my past, to my mother's family. She wanted to erase everything that came before her. Abe's cider mill. I had vague, dreamlike memories of it from when I was very young, before my mom died. The smell of apples, sharp and sweet. The low rumble of a machine. The feel of my grandfather's calloused hand holding mine, his laugh a deep, rumbling sound that made me feel safe. He'd send us a crate of cider every autumn, the glass jugs cold and sweating. After my mom was gone, the shipments stopped. My dad never talked about him, and I was too young and too lost in my own grief to ask. "A worthless wreck," Cheryl's voice echoed in my head. A burden. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was a collapsing pile of wood and rust. But it was mine. It was the only thing in the entire world that was mine. I looked at the $100. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a bus ticket. I stood up, my legs stiff. I had no phone, no friends to call. The people I'd known in high school were all moving on to college, to jobs, to lives that had a clear path forward. My path was a gravel road leading to a ruin. For a moment, a wave of pure, cold panic washed over me. I could just throw the key away, take the $100, and try to disappear into the city. But where would I go? What would I do? The key in my pocket felt heavy, like an anchor. Maybe it was pulling me down, or maybe it was the only thing stopping me from drifting away completely. I clutched it in my fist, the metal edges digging into my palm. I had a destination. It was a terrible destination, probably, a foolish one, but it was a direction, and right now, that was more than enough. The bus station was a symphony of quiet desperation. People sleeping on hard plastic chairs, people staring blankly at the departures board, people talking in hushed, urgent tones on payphones. I felt invisible, just another piece of human luggage waiting to be transported. I walked up to the ticket counter, the glass thick and smudged. "A ticket to Black Creek," I said, my voice sounding small and thin. The woman behind the counter, a tired-looking woman with a name tag that said Brenda, didn't even look up from her computer. She typed for a moment. "Don't go to Black Creek. Bus drops you in Millerton. It's about 5 miles from there." "Okay, a ticket to Millerton, then." $84, one way?" "Yes, one way." She printed the ticket and slid it under the glass. I handed over the crisp bills Cheryl had given me. My entire net worth. I got back a few crumpled dollars and some coins. I clutched the ticket and walked over to the designated gate. Gate 14, northbound. The bus wasn't for another hour. I sat down, placing my duffel bag between my feet, and watched the people come and go. Everyone seemed to be either leaving someone or meeting someone. There were tearful goodbyes and joyful hugs. I was a party of one. A self-contained unit of departure with no corresponding arrival. I thought about my grandfather, Abe. I tried to pull his face into focus in my memory, but it was blurry, softened by time. I remembered his hands more than his face. Big, strong, stained with grease and something dark, maybe apple juice. He always wore flannel shirts, even in the summer. He smelled like sawdust and cinnamon. He would lift me up and set me on his shoulders, and I could see the whole world from up there. Or at least, the whole world of his workshop. Why had he let it all go? Why had he let the mill fall apart? If he'd cared about it, if he'd cared about me, wouldn't he have left me something better than a ruin and a tax bill? The question soured in my gut. Maybe Cheryl was right. Maybe it was just his final, careless act. A problem he'd left for someone else to clean up. The bus arrived with a great hiss of its air brakes. The driver, a stout man with a graying mustache, grunted as he took my ticket. I found a seat by a window that was clouded with a film of road grime. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass as we pulled out of the station, the city's concrete and steel slowly giving way to sprawling suburbs, then to strip malls, and finally, to open country. For hours, I watched the landscape change. Flat, manicured fields of corn and soy stretched to the horizon, dotted with identical-looking farmhouses and towering silos. The sky was a vast, pale blue canvas. There was a hypnotic rhythm to it. The endless rows of crops, the steady hum of the bus engine. I felt myself drifting, not quite asleep, but not fully awake either. I was in a state of suspension, moving through a world I had no part in. As the afternoon wore on, the land began to change again. The flat plains buckled and rose into gentle, rolling hills. The trees grew taller and thicker, crowding the edges of the road. We passed through small towns with names like Pleasant Valley and Harmony. They were just a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads, a gas station, a church with a tall white steeple, a general store. Then we'd be back in the woods again. The light began to fade, turning the sky from blue to a soft, bruised purple. The bus was mostly empty now. Just me, an elderly woman knitting in the front, and a young man with headphones, his head bobbing to a silent beat. "Millerton," the driver called out, his voice startling me from my daze. He pulled over to the side of a two-lane road. There was no station, not even a shelter, just a simple green sign with the town's name on it. I grabbed my duffel bag and shuffled to the front. "Thanks," I mumbled. The driver just nodded. The doors hissed open, and I stepped out into the cool evening air. It smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and something else, something clean and wild. The bus pulled away with another hiss and a cloud of diesel fumes, its red taillights shrinking in the twilight until they were gone. And then there was silence. A profound, deep silence that I could feel in my bones. It was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. I stood by the side of the road for a long moment, completely disoriented. In front of me was the town of Millerton. It was even smaller than I'd imagined. A single main street with a row of two-story brick buildings on either side. A few windows glowed with warm, yellow light. A single traffic light blinked yellow, its rhythm slow and lonely. There were no people, no cars. It felt like a movie set after the crew had gone home for the night. According to the bus driver, Black Creek was 5 miles away. I had no idea which direction. I picked one and started walking, my bag feeling heavier with every step. The main street was short. I passed a post office, a small grocery store with a hand-painted sign, and a bar with a neon beer sign flickering in the window. A man stepped out of the bar, saw me, and gave a slow, curious nod. He was old, with a weathered face and a baseball cap pulled down low. I nodded back, feeling like an intruder. I was clearly not from around here. My city clothes, my posture, everything about me screamed out of place. At the end of the street, the road forked. There was a wooden signpost, its letters faded and peeling. One arrow pointed left, labeled State Highway. The other pointed right, down a darker, narrower road. The letters on that arrow were almost completely gone, but I could just make out the faint shape of the words, Black Creek Road. I took a deep breath and turned right. The road was paved for the first 100 yards, then it turned to gravel. The trees closed in overhead, forming a dark canopy. There were no streetlights here. The only light came from a sliver of moon that peeked through the leaves. My footsteps were loud on the loose stones. Every snap of a twig in the woods beside me made me jump. I was a city kid. This kind of darkness, this kind of quiet, was alien and terrifying. I thought about turning back, about trying to find a place to stay in Millerton, but I only had $16 left. I had to keep going. I walked for what felt like hours. The road climbed steadily, and my legs began to ache. I had to shift my bag from one shoulder to the other every few minutes. I was tired, I was hungry, and I was scared. A part of me was screaming that this was a mistake, that I should have just stayed in the city, that sleeping on a park bench was better than walking toward a ruin in the middle of a dark forest. But another part of me, a quieter, more stubborn part, kept putting one foot in front of the other. This was the only path I had. Finally, the trees began to thin. The road leveled out. Ahead of me, silhouetted against the night sky, I saw the shape of a large building. It was bigger than a house, with a steep, sagging roofline. This had to be it. As I got closer, I could see it more clearly, the cider mill. It was a massive, rambling structure, dark and silent. Ivy crawled up one side, its leaves like a dark stain against the weathered wood. Several windows were boarded up, and a section of the roof looked like it was caving in. Cheryl hadn't been exaggerating. It was a wreck. A rusty wire fence, half fallen, marked the edge of the property. The gravel road continued up to a set of huge barn-style doors. I stopped in front of them, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the end of the line. I dropped my bag on the ground and pulled the iron key from my pocket. It felt cold and heavy in my trembling hand. There was a huge, old-fashioned padlock on the doors. I slid the key into the lock. It was stiff, and I had to jiggle it, putting my whole body into turning it. For a second, I thought it was rusted shut. Then, with a loud, grating groan, the mechanism turned. The lock clicked open. I pulled the heavy lock off the hasp and let it fall. It hit the ground with a dull thud. I took a deep breath and grabbed the edge of one of the huge doors. It was heavy, and it scraped against the ground as I pulled it open, the sound echoing in the night. A wave of air rolled out from the darkness inside. It was a smell I recognized instantly, a ghost on my tongue. The sharp, sweet, fermented scent of 1,000,000 old apples, the smell of dust and damp wood and decay. But beneath it all, that faint, lingering sweetness. It was the smell of my grandfather. It was the smell of a memory I thought I'd lost forever. I stood there on the threshold, between the dark woods behind me and the deeper darkness ahead, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt like I might have found my way home. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, pulling the heavy door just enough to slip through. I didn't close it all the way, leaving a thin sliver of pale moonlight to cut through the oppressive dark. The air inside was thick and still, heavy with the weight of years of silence. My eyes slowly adjusted, and shapes began to emerge from the gloom. I was in a vast, cavernous space. The ceiling was high, lost in shadow, crisscrossed with massive wooden beams. Moonlight from the crack in the door and a few grimy, unboarded windows high on the walls illuminated floating continents of dust. Directly in front of me was the heart of the operation, the press. It was an enormous machine of iron and wood, a mechanical beast sleeping in the center of the room. A huge screw, as thick as my body, rose toward the ceiling, connected to a long wooden beam that must have been used for leverage. Below it was a round, flat base where the apples would have been crushed. To the side were vats and barrels and a confusing tangle of belts and pulleys that snaked across the room, connecting to other, smaller machines I couldn't identify. Everything was covered in a thick, soft blanket of gray dust. It looked like a photograph from a history book, a place frozen in time. I set my duffel bag down, the sound muffled by the dust on the floor. I ran my hand along the cold, pitted iron of the press. It felt solid, permanent. My grandfather had worked here. His hands had turned these wheels, pulled these levers. My father had probably worked here as a boy. This place wasn't just a building. It was a container for my family's history, a history I knew almost nothing about. I felt a strange mix of awe and profound sadness. All this life, all this work had just stopped. I started to walk, my footsteps silent on the dusty floorboards. I moved deeper into the mill, away from the sliver of light from the door. My hand trailed along a long workbench that ran the length of one wall. It was cluttered with old tools, jars filled with nuts and bolts, and strange, custom-made metal contraptions. Everything was coated in that same layer of dust, except for one spot. In the center of the workbench, there was a perfect rectangle of clean wood. Something had been sitting there until very recently. And next to that clean spot was a single, white envelope. My breath caught in my throat. It was stark against the grayness of everything else. It hadn't been here for years. It had been placed here. For me. My heart hammered against my ribs. I picked it up. The paper was clean, crisp. My name was written on the front in a strong, slightly shaky hand. Leo. I knew that handwriting. I'd only seen it a few times, on birthday cards when I was a little kid, but it was unmistakable. It was my grandfather's. I turned the envelope over in my hands. It wasn't sealed. I carefully pulled out the single folded sheet of paper inside. The paper was the same as the envelope, clean and new. This wasn't an old letter he'd forgotten. This was a message he had left behind, knowing I would come. Knowing Cheryl would kick me out. Knowing this would be the only place I had left to go. The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold air in the mill. He had seen this coming. I unfolded the paper. The ink was a dark, bold blue. "Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and things have gone just about as wrong as I feared they would. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the state you find this place in. I'm sorry for the burden this must be. I know it looks like I gave up on it, like I gave up on everything. That's not the truth. The truth is, I was trying to protect it. And you." I had to stop and take a breath. His voice was so clear in the words, that low, rumbling tone I barely remembered. I could almost hear him speaking in the silent room. "This mill wasn't just my business, kid. It was our family's anchor. It's been in our blood for 3 generations. But some things are more important than business. About 10 years ago, a wolf came to this valley. A wolf dressed in a suit, with a briefcase full of money and a smile full of teeth. It wanted the land. All of it. It offered prices people couldn't refuse, and if they did refuse, it had other ways of convincing them. It bought up the farms, the woods, the houses. It wanted to turn our home into a playground for the rich. I told them to go to hell. They didn't like that. They started to press me. Not with smiles anymore. With threats. Accidents started happening around the mill. A busted line here, a tampered machine there. They were trying to bleed me dry, to make it impossible to keep going. So I made a choice. I would not sell. But I would not fight them head-on either. I couldn't win that way. Instead, I decided to hide. I let the mill die. I let it get covered in ivy and dust. I made it look worthless, abandoned. I was hiding it in plain sight. Because sometimes, the most valuable things need to look like they're worth nothing at all. My hands were shaking as I held the paper. This wasn't neglect. It was a strategy. A desperate, long-term act of defiance. I don't know what your situation is now, but I can guess. I know your father married that woman. I tried to reach out after he passed, but my letters were returned. I knew she'd cut you off the second you were old enough. I'm sorry I couldn't be there for you, Leo. My biggest regret. Tears pricked my eyes. He had tried. He hadn't forgotten me. But I left you this place. It's more than a wreck, I promise you. It's a fortress. And it's a puzzle. I had to hide things, break them up, make them hard to find. I couldn't risk them finding it all. This letter is the first piece. You found it, which means you have my blood in you. You have my stubbornness. I don't have much time. My heart is giving out, so listen close. The heart of the press doesn't just crush apples. It protects what's most important. Go to the great press. Look beneath the stone. You'll find the next step there. Be careful. And be strong. I know you can be. You're my grandson. All my love, Abe. The letter fell from my fingers and fluttered to the dusty floor. I sank down onto an old wooden stool, my legs suddenly unable to hold me. The silence of the mill rushed back in, but it was different now. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence full of secrets, full of intent. My grandfather hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't abandoned this place. He had turned it into a vault, and he had just handed me the key. I wasn't an heir to a ruin. I was the keeper of a secret. The sheer weight of it pressed down on me. I looked at the giant, sleeping press in the center of the room, its form dark and monolithic in the gloom. Look beneath the stone. It was a riddle, a task, a beginning. I was standing in the middle of a mystery my grandfather had built with his own hands, and I had no idea if I was strong enough to solve it. The initial shock gave way to a wave of something else, something heavy and cold. Grief. It was a raw, unprocessed grief I had been holding at bay for 2 years. I cried. Not loud, sobbing tears, but silent, hot tears that tracked clean paths through the grime on my cheeks. I cried for my grandfather, for the stubborn old man who fought a silent war all alone and died thinking he had failed. I cried for my dad, who had been too lost in his own new life to see how much I was struggling. And I cried for myself, for the scared, lonely kid who was sitting in a dark, derelict building with a ghost's puzzle in his lap. I was 18 years old. I should have been worrying about college applications or a summer job, not deciphering cryptic messages and fighting corporate wolves. This was too much. The responsibility felt like a physical weight, like one of the mill's great stones settling on my chest. What did he expect me to do? I was a teenager with $16 in a duffel bag. He was asking me to be a warrior, and I didn't even have a shield. The urge to run was immense. I could just walk out, leave the letter on the bench, close the door, and never look back. I could go back to Millerton, use my last few dollars for a meal, and then… what? Hitchhike? Live on the streets? The fantasy evaporated as soon as it formed. There was no out. This was it. This dusty, broken-down mill was the only thing I had. I stood up and began to pace, the motion a small act of defiance against the paralysis that threatened to take hold. I walked the perimeter of the great room, my hand trailing along the rough wooden walls. I passed stacks of old apple crates, their stenciled logos faded. Abe's best. A pang of pride, sharp and unexpected, went through me. This was his. This was ours. I peered into the adjoining rooms. One was a bottling room, full of dusty green bottles and wooden racks. Another was a cold storage area, its thick, insulated door hanging open. It was a whole world, shuttered and sleeping. He believed in me. That was the part that was so hard to reconcile. "I know you can be," he'd written. How could he know that? He hadn't seen me in over a decade. He was putting his faith in a memory of a little boy. He had no idea how weak and lost that little boy had become. Or maybe he did. Maybe he knew that sometimes the only way to find out if you're strong is to have no other choice but to be. I stopped my pacing and stood before the press again. It loomed over me, silent and imposing. The heart of the press doesn't just crush apples. Look beneath the stone. I looked at the machine. The main screw drove down onto a thick iron plate. That plate pressed onto a circular platform which was made of more iron. Where was the stone? I walked around it, my eyes scanning every detail. The entire machine sat on a raised foundation of poured concrete. No stone there. I knelt down, peering into the shadows underneath. There was a pit below the press, designed to collect the juice. It was lined with wood, now black and warped with age. Then I saw it. The base of the press wasn't just concrete. The concrete foundation was ringed by massive, rough-hewn blocks of granite, like an ancient, sacrificial altar. The stone. It had to be. I ran my hands over the cool, gritty surface of the blocks. They were huge, solid, and seemed to be mortared together. There was no obvious loose piece, no handle, no seam. I pushed against one. It didn't budge. Of course not. It was part of the foundation. Was it a metaphor? Beneath the stone. Did he mean something else entirely? Frustration began to bubble up. This was a stupid game. I was tired and hungry and chasing riddles in the dark. I kicked at the base of the granite block, my sneaker making a dull thud. Nothing. I was about to give up, to just find a corner and collapse for the night, when my eyes caught something. Not on the stone itself, but on the floorboards right beside it. A single, dark stain, different from the other watermarks and oil spots. It was a perfect semicircle, an arc of discoloration right where a floorboard met the granite base. It looked like something had been pried up, over and over from that same spot. My heart started beating faster again. I got down on my hands and knees. The floorboards were thick oak planks laid tight together, but this one, the one next to the stain, seemed to have a slightly wider gap. I dug my fingernails into the crack and pulled. The wood was stiff, but it moved. It lifted. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me. This was it. And at this moment, I have to pause and just ask you something. Have you ever been given a responsibility you felt totally unprepared for? A moment where everything in you wanted to run, but some small, stubborn voice told you to stay and face it. Maybe it was a family crisis, a job you weren't ready for, or just a promise you had to keep. That feeling of being totally overwhelmed, but knowing, deep down, that this was a defining moment. If you're watching this and you know that feeling, I want you to know you're not alone. So many of us are handed things we don't think we can carry. But the story isn't about the weight. It's about the decision to lift it. Stick with me, because this story is about what happens when you decide to try anyway. And if this is hitting home for you, if you've ever had to find strength you didn't know you had, hit that subscribe button. This channel is a community for people who get it. We're all just trying to carry what we've been given. Now, let's get back to that floorboard. I worked my fingers deeper into the crack, the splintery wood digging into my skin, and pulled with all my strength. With a low groan of protesting nails, the board came loose. It wasn't a full-length plank, just a short section about 3 feet long, expertly cut to be removable. I lifted it out and set it aside. Beneath it was a dark, hollow space. And in that space, nestled in the dirt and grime, was a metal box. It was an old military-style ammo can, painted olive drab, with a heavy latch on the front. It was bigger than a shoebox and surprisingly heavy when I lifted it out. The cold, solid weight of it felt like confirmation. This was the next step. I carried the box over to the workbench and set it down in the single beam of moonlight. The latch was stiff, but not locked. I pried it open with a loud metallic clang. I lifted the lid, my breath held tight in my chest. The inside was packed. On top was another envelope, this one thicker, addressed to me in the same familiar script. Beneath it, I could see stacks of papers held together with rubber bands, a few small, leather-bound notebooks, and something I hadn't seen in years, a small, black, portable cassette player. The kind with chunky buttons and a little plastic window. A cassette tape was already inside it. My hands went for the letter first. It was my only guide in this strange, dark world. I unfolded the pages. There were several this time. "Leo," it began again. "You found it. Good lad. I knew you would. I hope the first letter didn't scare you off. Things are about to get more complicated, I'm afraid, but they're also about to get a lot clearer. The wolf I told you about has a name. Northwood Development Corporation. They're not just some local real estate company, they're sharks. They came into this valley with a grand vision. A private ski resort, luxury cabins, a golf course. A whole world for the 1%, built on the bones of our world. They bought out most of the families cheap. A lot of people were struggling, and Northwood's offers seemed like a lifeline. For those who held out, like the Millers down the road or the Jensens on the Ridge, Northwood played dirty. They'd find a way to block access to their land, file frivolous lawsuits to drain their savings, or suddenly have the county inspector show up and find a dozen code violations that had never been a problem before. One by one, they all folded. They took the money and left. All except me. I was the last holdout on this side of the mountain.
This mill,
and the acreage it sits on was the key to their whole plan. It connects the lower valley to the summit. Without it, their resort is cut in half. So they came for me, hard. The accidents I mentioned, they weren't accidents. They cut the main drive belt for the press right before the harvest season. They contaminated a whole batch of cider with a cleaning agent. They even tried to start a fire in the back storage barn. I was able to put it out, but it was a clear message. They were willing to do anything. The papers in this box are my proof. For years, I documented everything, every threat, every act of sabotage. I have dates, names, even photographs I took from a distance of their men snooping around the property. The notebooks contain my logs, my correspondence with a lawyer who tried to help me, and the pitiful responses from the local sheriff who was clearly in their pocket. It's all there, Leo, a chronicle of their crimes. I looked into the box at the stacks of paper. It wasn't just a collection of documents. It was my grandfather's armor. It was his lonely, meticulous war. The letter continued. But there's more. There's a reason they had so much leverage, not just on me, but on the whole town. It's about a debt. Not my debt, but one I took on. I need you to understand this part. It's important. I don't want you to think I was a fool. Listen to the tape. It's easier to say it than to write it. My voice is weak, but the story is strong. After you've listened, there's one last secret. The most important one. It's hidden where fire is born, but where it has long since died. The old boiler. Go there after you hear my story. I'm trusting you with this, Leo, with all of it. The truth is a heavy thing to carry, but you come from a long line of people who carried heavy things. It's in your bones. He signed it simply, Abe. I put the letter down, my mind reeling. Northwood Development. A concrete villain, a name for the wolf, and a box full of weapons to fight it with. My fear was slowly being replaced by a cold, simmering anger. They hadn't just tormented my grandfather, they had stolen the last years of his life, forcing him into this lonely isolation. They had tried to burn down his legacy. I picked up the small cassette player. It felt like a relic from another century. I pressed the eject button, and the little door popped open. The tape was a simple, generic brand, with "For Leo" written on the label in Abe's handwriting. I clicked it shut, took a deep breath, and pressed the play button. There was a click, the whir of the tape, and then a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. The sound of my grandfather clearing his throat. His voice, when it came, was thin, raspy, and full of effort. But it was him. It was his voice, right here in the room with me. Leo. Leo, my boy. If you're hearing this, I guess you made it through the letters. He paused, and I could hear his labored breath. Good. Good. This part is hard. I need you to know why. Why I couldn't just fight them in the open. Another pause. The hiss of the tape filled the silence. About 12 years back, he began, his voice a little stronger now, as if telling the story gave him strength. There was a young man in town, a good kid from a good family, the Pattersons. They owned the farm over the ridge. This boy, he was smart, but he got in over his head, got tangled up with a loan shark. Not one of the local toughs. This was something different, organized. He'd borrowed money for a business idea that went south, and the interest was crippling him. They were threatening him, threatening his family. He was terrified. He came to me one night, right here in this mill, told me everything. He was about to lose the farm. His father had a bad heart. The stress would have killed him. I listened, captivated, the dusty mill fading away, replaced by the scene his words were painting. The loan shark, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, was a subsidiary of Northwood Development. It was one of the tools they used. They'd get their hooks into a family through debt, and then they'd reel them in and take their land. It was a racket. I couldn't let that happen to the Pattersons. So I did something stupid. Or maybe it was the only thing I could do. I paid the boys' debt. All of it. It nearly wiped out my savings. But it was done. The boy was free. His family never knew. A wave of understanding washed over me. This was the promise he'd mentioned, the debt he'd taken on. But Northwood knew. Abe's voice crackled from the small speaker. I had interfered. I had cost them a piece of land they wanted. From that day on, I was their target. They couldn't use debt against me, so they used force. But they also had something to hold over me. If I ever went to the press, if I ever exposed their tactics, they would ruin that boy. They would fabricate a story, claim he was involved in their racket, that he was a criminal. They would destroy his life and his family's name. And I had given my word that I would protect him. So my hands were tied. I could document their crimes against me, but I couldn't expose them without sacrificing that boy. It was a checkmate. The tape went silent for a long moment. I could hear the faint sound of him taking a sip of water. So I hid, and I saved. Every dollar I could scrape together, I put away. For you. Because I knew a day was coming when you would need it. A day when you would be standing right where you are now. Which brings me to the last piece of the puzzle, the boiler room. The boiler room. Where fire is born, but where it has long since died. Go in there, Leo. Behind the old access panel on the left side of the firebox, you'll find what I saved. It's for you. All of it. And this is where you have a choice I never had. His voice became incredibly clear, incredibly focused. Take the money, kid. There's enough there to start over, anywhere you want. New name, new life. Go to college, see the world. You don't owe this place anything. You don't owe me anything. Your happiness is the most important thing. Disappear and be free. That is a good choice, and I would be proud of you for making it. He paused. Or, there's the other choice, the harder one. The money is also enough to fight them. It's enough to hire a real lawyer, not some small-town guy who's scared of his own shadow. It's enough to file injunctions, to take them to court, to use the evidence in that box. It will be a long, ugly, expensive war. You'll probably lose. They have teams of lawyers and endless resources. It's a fool's errand, maybe, but it's the right one. It's the one I would have chosen if my hands weren't tied. The choice is yours, Leo. Run and live, or stay and fight. There's no wrong answer. No judgment from me either way. Just know that I love you, and I'm proud of the man you've become. The tape clicked off. The whirring stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I sat there, the little plastic player in my hand, my grandfather's last words echoing in the cavernous space. He hadn't just left me a puzzle. He had left me a choice. A choice between a life of freedom and a life of purpose. A choice between saving myself and saving his legacy. I found an old landline phone on the wall in what must have been the office, a small, dusty room off the main floor. It was a rotary phone, ancient and yellowed. On a whim, I picked up the receiver. I almost dropped it in shock when I heard a dial tone. Faint and crackling, but there. He had kept the line active. Of course he had. In one of the notebooks from the box, he had mentioned a lawyer, a man named Arthur Gable, in a bigger town about an hour away. He'd written that Gable was too expensive for me, but honest. There was a phone number. My fingers trembled as I stuck them into the holes of the rotary dial and slowly, deliberately dialed the number. It rang 3 times. A calm, professional voice answered. Gable Law. Hello, I stammered, my own voice sounding foreign. My name is Leo. I'm Abe's grandson. From the Black Creek cider mill. There was a pause on the other end. Abe's grandson, the voice, Mr. Gable's voice, repeated slowly. I see. I was sorry to hear of his passing. He was a stubborn man, a good one. He left me some things, I said, my voice gaining a bit of confidence. A box, with documents, and a recording. He mentioned you. Another, longer pause. I see, Mr. Gable said again, his tone shifting, becoming more focused. And what did he ask you to do? I looked around the dark, silent mill, at the ghost of the press, at the stacks of old crates, at the dust motes dancing in the single beam of moonlight. I saw my grandfather, alone in this place for years, fighting a quiet war. I saw the Patterson boy, saved by an act of secret kindness. I saw the line of families driven from their homes. And I saw the choice laid out before me, clear as glass. He asked me to fight, I said. And the words, once spoken, settled into my bones and became the truth. He left me the means to fight them. Northwood Development. Mr. Gable was silent for a full minute. I could hear the faint sound of him breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was all business. The evidence your grandfather collected. It might be compelling. But Northwood has the best lawyers in the state. Their pockets are bottomless. This will not be a simple lawsuit. It will be a war of attrition. They will try to bury you in legal fees, motions, and delays. Selling the property is the smart move, the financially prudent move. Fighting them is the right one. But it will cost you everything. Time, money, and peace of mind. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do? Run and live, or stay and fight? The choice was mine. No judgment. But I could feel my grandfather's pride, his hope, reaching across time through that crackling phone line. I wasn't that lost kid on the curb anymore. I was Abe's grandson. Yes, I said, my voice clear and steady. I'm staying. I'm fighting. After the call with Mr. Gable, a strange calm settled over me. The decision, once made, felt less like a burden and more like a foundation. For the first time in years, I had a purpose that was bigger than just surviving the day. I was terrified, yes, but it was a clean, sharp fear, not the dull, suffocating dread I had been living with under Cheryl's roof. This was the fear that comes before a battle, not the fear of a caged animal. Mr. Gable had given me instructions. He would start by reviewing the documents. He told me to stay put, to not engage with anyone from Northwood, and to start making the place look lived in. Optics matter, he'd said. An abandoned property is an easy target. A home is something else entirely. A home. The word echoed in the vast, empty space. This wreck was my home now. I had to make it one. But first, I had to find the last piece of my inheritance. The boiler room was at the back of the mill, in a brick-lined extension off the main building. The door was thick metal and opened with a rusty shriek. The room was small and dark, dominated by a massive, iron-riveted boiler that looked like the engine of a steam locomotive. It was cold to the touch, its great belly long dormant. Where fire is born, but where it has long since died. I found the access panel on the side of the firebox, a small, square plate held in place by 4 bolts. They were rusted tight. I went back to the workbench and rummaged through the tools, my hands coated in grime. I found a heavy wrench that looked like it might fit. It took all my weight, grunting and straining in the darkness, but one by one, the bolts groaned and gave way. The panel came loose. I pulled it off and peered inside. It was dark, and the smell of old soot and rust was thick. I reached my hand in, my fingers brushing against cobwebs and loose brick. And then I felt it. A coarse, canvas-like fabric. A bag. I pulled it out. It was a heavy, canvas bank bag, the kind with a drawstring at the top. It was unexpectedly weighty. I fumbled with the knot on the drawstring, my fingers clumsy with anticipation. I finally got it open and turned it upside down. What fell out onto the dusty floor wasn't just cash. It was bundle after bundle of it, held together by brittle paper bands. Stacks of hundreds, 50s, 20s. A lifetime of scraped-together savings, a fortune. It was the means to start a new life. It was the war chest for the fight to come. I just stared at it, a pile of impossible hope on the dirty floor. My grandfather's final gift. The next morning, I woke up stiff and cold on a pile of old burlap sacks, the most comfortable bed I could find. But as the sun streamed through the high, dirty windows, lighting up the cavern of the mill, I didn't feel despair. I felt resolve. I took $100 from the bag, it felt like stealing, even though it was mine, and walked the 5 miles back to Millerton. The walk was different this time. I wasn't an exile arriving at a dead end. I was a resident, on my way to get supplies. In the small grocery store, the one with the hand-painted sign, I bought bread, peanut butter, a gallon of water, a flashlight, and a giant box of industrial-strength cleaning wipes. The woman at the counter, a kindly-looking lady with gray hair tied in a bun, watched me pile my purchases. "Big project?" she asked, her voice friendly. "Something like that," I said. "I'm staying out at the old cider mill." Her eyes widened slightly. "Abe's place? Your family?" "His grandson," I said. "Leo." A slow smile spread across her face. "Well, I'll be. Abe was a good man, stubborn as a mule, but good. The town hasn't been the same since he closed up. Welcome home, Leo." Welcome home. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. A stranger had just offered me the one thing I'd been missing for years. I felt a lump form in my throat. "Thank you," I managed to say. Back at the mill, the work began. I started with a single, manageable task: cleaning the workbench. I wiped away years of accumulated dust and grime, revealing the scarred, beautiful wood underneath. I organized the tools, hanging wrenches and hammers on the old pegboard. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. It was an act of reclamation. I was pushing back against the decay. I was imposing order on the chaos. For days, that was my life. I swept. I swept floors that hadn't seen a broom in a decade. Clouds of dust billowed up, so thick I had to tie a shirt around my face. I filled garbage bag after garbage bag with old, moldy papers, rotten bits of wood, and unidentifiable junk. I washed the windows, scrubbing away the grime until the afternoon light could pour in, clear and bright, transforming the space from a tomb to a cathedral of industry. The physical labor was grueling. My muscles ached. My hands were covered in blisters and cuts. But with every sweep of the broom, with every pane of glass I cleaned, I felt like I was also cleaning out the dark, dusty corners of my own heart. I was letting the light in. One afternoon, a dusty pickup truck I didn't recognize rumbled up the gravel road. An old man with a deeply lined face and clear blue eyes got out. He wore overalls and a faded John Deere cap. "You must be Abe's boy," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "His grandson," I corrected, leaning on my broom. "Close enough," he grunted. "Name's Earl. I worked here 30 years ago. Back when this place was the beating heart of the whole county." He looked around the now cleaner, brighter space, a nostalgic look in his eyes. "Abe taught me everything I know about fixing engines. Saw you were cleaning up, figured you might need a hand." He didn't wait for an answer. He walked right over to the silent press, ran a knowing hand over a gear, and said, "Your main drive belt is dry rotted. That's the first thing you'll need to fix if you ever want to see this beast run again." That evening, a sleek, black SUV I did not want to see drove up to the mill. A man in an expensive suit got out. He was the picture of corporate authority, from his polished shoes to his slicked-back hair. He had a fake, polished smile plastered on his face. "Leo?" he asked, extending a hand I did not take. "Markham, from Northwood Development. We were so sorry to hear about your grandfather's passing, and your father's, of course, a terrible run of luck." He looked around the mill, his eyes scanning everything, assessing. He was trying to look casual, but he was cataloging, calculating. "We know this property has been a burden," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "The back taxes, the state of disrepair. We'd like to help you with that. In fact, we've drawn up a very generous offer to take this old place off your hands. Enough to give you a fresh start. A very fresh start." He held out a thick, glossy folder. The offer. The easy way out. The escape route my grandfather had given me permission to take. I looked at his smiling, predatory face, and I thought of Abe, alone in this mill, documenting every threat. I thought of the word home, spoken by the woman in the grocery store. I thought of Earl, offering to help fix a machine that hadn't run in years. I looked at the folder, then back at him. I didn't say a word. I just shook my head, turned my back on him, and went back to sweeping. I heard him huff in frustration. A moment later, the SUV's engine roared to life, and it sped away, kicking up a cloud of gravel dust. The first shot in the war had been fired, and I hadn't flinched. That night, I didn't sleep on a pile of sacks. I had cleared out the small office, wiped down an old cot I found folded in a closet, and laid out a sleeping bag I'd bought in town. It wasn't much, but it was a bedroom. It was a start. I was no longer a guest, a ghost, or a burden. I was home. The weeks that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm. The fight with Northwood moved to a different battlefield, one of paper and legal jargon. Mr. Gable filed the first injunction, using a portion of Abe's money to prevent any sale or development of the land while we prepared our case. Northwood's lawyers responded with a flood of motions, just as he'd predicted. It was a slow, grinding process that happened mostly over the phone and through thick envelopes of mail that started appearing in the rusty mailbox at the end of the road. While the lawyers fought, I worked. Earl became a regular fixture at the mill. He'd show up most afternoons, a thermos of coffee in one hand and some obscure tool in the other. He treated the mill's machinery like a sleeping giant that he was determined to wake up. "This press," he'd say, tapping the huge iron screw, "she's got good bones. Abe never bought cheap." Together we took things apart, cleaned them, and put them back together. I learned the names of gears and gaskets, the difference between a ball bearing and a bushing. I learned the smell of grease and oil, the satisfying heft of a wrench in my hand. My own hands, once soft and useless, became calloused and capable. I was learning the language of the mill, the language of my grandfather. Other people from the town started to drift in. The woman from the grocery store, whose name I learned was Mary, brought me a hot casserole one evening, telling me I was too skinny. A young couple who had recently bought a small farm nearby stopped in to ask if the rumors were true, that I was trying to get the mill running again. They told me they were planting an orchard of heirloom apples and had been wondering where they would press them. They looked at the giant, silent machine with a hopeful reverence that made my heart ache. I was building more than just a legal case. I was accidentally rebuilding a community. The mill, even in its semi-derelict state, was becoming a center of gravity again, a place of possibility. It was a symbol of defiance against the sterile, gated future that Northwood wanted to impose on the valley. It turned out my grandfather wasn't the only one who had been holding out. He was just the only one who had never given up. The true turning point came one crisp autumn afternoon. Mr. Gable called. His voice was tense. "They're trying to get the case dismissed," he said. "They're claiming your grandfather's evidence is just the ramblings of a disgruntled old man. They're painting him as eccentric and unreliable. We need something more. We need a human element. The Patterson boy your grandfather mentioned in his recording, we need him to testify." My stomach dropped. This was the one thing Abe had been trying to avoid. Sacrificing the boy he had protected. "His name is David," Mr. Gable said quietly. "He's a veterinarian now, in the next county over. I have his number. But Leo, this has to be your call. We can proceed without him, but our chances are slim. If he testifies, it will corroborate everything. But it will also expose him to Northwood's retaliation. Your grandfather's dilemma is now yours." I held the phone, the weight of the choice pressing down on me. I thought about Abe's raspy voice on the tape, the impossible position he had been in. I walked over to a window I had recently cleaned and looked out over the valley. The leaves on the trees were turning brilliant shades of red and gold. It was beautiful, and it was worth fighting for. But was it worth risking another person's life? For 2 days, I was paralyzed. I couldn't work. I couldn't think. I just walked the floors of the mill, the choice echoing with every footstep. Finally, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't make the choice for David Patterson, but I could give him the one thing my grandfather couldn't: the truth. I dialed his number. I told him who I was, and I told him the entire story. I told him about my grandfather's sacrifice, about the box of evidence, and about the legal battle. I told him we were likely to lose without his help. And then I held my breath. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I knew," he said softly. "I never knew the details, but I knew Abe saved me. I've been living with that debt my whole life. My father passed away peacefully a few years ago on the farm he loved. My kids play in the fields he worked, all because of your grandfather." He took a shaky breath. "It's not a risk, Leo. It's an honor. Tell your lawyer I'll be there." David's testimony changed everything. He was a respected professional, and his story of Northwood's predatory lending practices, corroborated by Abe's meticulous notes, was damning. The local news picked up the story. Local vet exposes developers' strong-arm tactics. Suddenly, we weren't just one boy against a corporation. We were a community fighting back. Other families, who had been forced to sell years ago, came forward with their own stories. The case didn't just continue, it exploded. The fight isn't over. Northwood is still fighting, of course, with appeals and delays. But the tide has turned. The mill is slowly coming back to life. With help from Earl and a few other old-timers, we replaced the main drive belt. One day, we threw the switch, and with a groan and a shudder, the great press began to turn for the first time in a decade. We haven't pressed any apples yet, but we will. The young couple with the heirloom orchard has promised us their first harvest. I live at the mill now. The small office is my bedroom, my kitchen, my whole world. It's not fancy, but it's mine. I built it. Or rather, my grandfather built it for me, and I was just strong enough to turn the key. My stepmother thought she was exiling me to a graveyard of worthless memories. She couldn't have been more wrong. Abe didn't leave me a building, he left me a purpose. He didn't leave me a burden, he left me a choice. And in making that choice, in deciding to stay and fight for this place, I found my home. I found my family. I found myself. Sometimes, the inheritance that looks the most broken is the one that has the power to make you whole. So, what does home mean to you? Is it the place you were born, or is it a place you had to build? Is it a place you ran to, or a place you chose to fight for? I want to hear your stories. Let me know in the comments below, because I read every single one. Your stories matter. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe in the power of choosing the harder right over the easier wrong, then hit that subscribe button and join this community. We are a collection of people who know that sometimes you have to dig through the ruins to find the foundation of who you're meant to be. Thank you for listening.